I spent months tracking down the strangest celebrity burial sites in history, and what I discovered will shock you. One star was buried in his most famous costume. Another's body went missing for 3 months. And wait until you hear about the legendary actress whose ashes were scattered from a vintage warplane. These stories are stranger than any script Hollywood ever wrote. The final curtain call for Hollywood's brightest stars wasn't always a traditional cemetery plot with a marble headstone. What I discovered while researching these stories will absolutely blow your mind. And trust me, some of these tales are so strange, you'll think I'm making them up. Let's start with the comedy legend whose body became the center of an international crime. Charlie Chaplin, the star whose body was stolen. The Little Tramp's final act became one of the strangest chapters in Hollywood history. After his peaceful passing in Switzerland on Christmas Day, 1977, Chaplin was laid to rest in the quiet Goss Cemetery near his final home. But his eternal peace would be dramatically disturbed just 3 months later in a crime that shocked the world. Here's something that'll break your heart. Behind the comedic genius lay a childhood of unimaginable poverty and abuse that would have destroyed lesser spirits. Born into destitution, young Charlie was forced to watch his mother slowly descend into madness, while his alcoholic father abandoned the family completely. When his mother was committed to a mental asylum, 5-year-old Charlie was sent to live with his abusive, violent father, who regularly beat him. The future comedy legend spent nights crying himself to sleep, wondering why he'd been cursed with such horrific circumstances. March 2nd, 1978. Cemetery workers arrived to discover something horrifying. Chaplin's grave had been desecrated, his oak coffin completely missing. Police were baffled. The gravesite showed no significant signs of disturbance, despite the considerable weight of the coffin. The precision suggested professionals, not vandals. The mystery deepened when Chaplin's widow Una began receiving bizarre phone calls demanding $600,000, that's approximately $2.5 million today, for the return of her husband's remains. The caller provided photographic evidence that they indeed possessed Chaplin's body and threatened further desecration if payment wasn't made. What made this ordeal particularly cruel was that Chaplin had already endured decades of persecution during his lifetime. During the McCarthy era, his left-leaning political views made him a target of FBI harassment under J. Edgar Hoover. The trauma of facing 23 years in prison during the Joan Barry paternity trial had left him emotionally scarred. Even in passing, it seemed Charlie couldn't find peace. Rather than quietly paying the ransom, Una worked with Swiss police to set a trap. For weeks, the investigation seemed to yield nothing, as the family endured the psychological torment of knowing Charlie's body remained in criminal hands. The breakthrough came when police traced calls to a mechanic named Roman Ward and his accomplice. Their scheme unraveled when they attempted to collect the ransom. On May 17, 1978, nearly 3 months after the theft, Chaplin was reburied in his original grave, but this time with reinforced concrete surrounding the coffin. Drop a comment if you think those criminals got what they deserved, because wait until you hear about the star who chose one of the most romantic final gestures in Hollywood history. Rudolph Valentino, The Borrowed Crypt. The silent screen's greatest lover rests in a burial arrangement so strange, it became the subject of one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries, involving a borrowed tomb, annual roses from an anonymous woman in black, and a decades-long quest for a permanent resting place that never materialized. Here's what nobody talks about. Valentino's legendary magnetism masked a profound loneliness that haunted him throughout his brief life. Born Rodolfo Guglielmi in Italy, he arrived in America as a penniless immigrant who worked as a taxi dancer, often paid by lonely women to provide companionship. His 2 marriages were disasters, the first lasting only hours when his bride locked him out of their hotel room. Valentino's sudden passing from peritonitis in August 1926 at age 31 triggered unprecedented public mourning, with an estimated 100,000 fans rioting outside the funeral home in New York. His remains were transported to Hollywood for burial, but his estate was insufficient to purchase an appropriate tomb. What makes Valentino's burial truly unusual is that his final resting place was intended to be temporary. His friend, June Mathis, offered her family crypt at Hollywood Memorial Park Cemetery as a temporary solution until his estate could afford something more fitting. This temporary arrangement became permanent when Mathis herself unexpectedly passed away the following year. In a macabre twist, when Mathis passed away in 1927, her family had Valentino's casket moved to a neighboring crypt to make room for her remains. Hollywood's greatest romantic icon ended up in what amounts to borrowed space, one crypt away from his intended location. The strangeness doesn't end there. Beginning on the first anniversary of Valentino's passing in 1927, a veiled woman dressed entirely in black began appearing at his crypt, leaving a single red rose. This mysterious woman in black continued her annual pilgrimage for decades, becoming a Hollywood legend. For over a decade, fans contributed to a fund for Valentino's proposed grand mausoleum. But the memorial was never built. Financial records eventually revealed that most donations had been misappropriated. Today, visitors to Valentino's crypt find a modest bronze plaque with the simple inscription, Rudolph Valentino, 1895 to 1926. The relatively understated marker gives little indication of either his tremendous fame or the extraordinary circumstances that led to his permanent residence in a borrowed tomb. Question for you. Do you believe the woman in black was genuinely devoted, or was it all publicity? Let me know in the comments, because our next star's burial became the center of Hollywood's most disturbing crime. Bela Lugosi, buried in his Dracula cape. The man who defined Count Dracula for generations took his most famous role with him to eternity in one of Hollywood's most thematically appropriate burials. Lugosi's final resting arrangement reflects both his inescapable identification with the vampire count and the tragic typecasting that ultimately limited his career. Behind the iconic cape and aristocratic accent lay a man tormented by chronic pain and crippling addiction. For 20 years, Lugosi battled morphine and methadone dependency that began when he sought relief from sciatic neuritis. By the 1950s, his addiction was so severe that he could barely function. In 1955, at age 73, he voluntarily committed himself to a mental health facility, courageously admitting his addiction publicly. A shocking confession in an era when such admissions meant career elimination. Lugosi's passing from a heart attack in August 1956 came after years of career decline, addiction struggles, and financial difficulties. His family had limited funds for funeral arrangements, but they understood one thing clearly. Despite Lugosi's lifelong frustration at being typecast, the Dracula role remained his defining legacy. In what became one of Hollywood's most symbolic burial decisions, Lugosi was laid to rest wearing one of the original Dracula capes from the Universal Pictures production. Though often reported that this was Lugosi's request, family members later clarified that it was actually their decision, believing he would have appreciated the gesture connecting him eternally with the role that made him immortal in cinema history. What makes this particularly unusual is that authentic Dracula capes from the original production were valuable Hollywood artifacts even in 1956. Using one for burial effectively removed a significant piece of film history from existence. Perhaps most unusual was the funeral itself. Despite Lugosi's fame, few Hollywood figures attended his service, reflecting how thoroughly the industry had abandoned him in his later years. However, hundreds of ordinary fans appeared, many wearing vampire capes in tribute, creating the surreal image of a sea of Draculas bidding farewell to the original. Today, visitors to Lugosi's grave in Holy Cross Cemetery find a black granite monument featuring his likeness and the inscription, Beloved Father, Bela Lugosi, 1882 to 1956. Though the cape remains invisibly present beneath the earth, the association between actor and character continues. But that strange burial pales in comparison to what happened to our next star. Jayne Mansfield, the heart-shaped gravestone. The blonde bombshell's tragic passing at age 34 in a horrific 1967 car accident led to one of Hollywood's most distinctive and unusual memorial sites, a heart-shaped monument that reflects both her bombshell image and the extraordinary cult of personality that continues surrounding her memory. Here's what breaks my heart. Behind Mansfield's glamorous facade lay profound insecurities rooted in a traumatic childhood. Born Vera Jane Palmer She lost her father to a heart attack when she was just 3 years old, leaving her to be raised by a cold, emotionally distant mother. Desperate for the love and attention she never received at home, Jayne threw herself into performing, but the hunger for approval would plague her entire life. Mansfield's burial arrangements were immediately complicated by sensationalized and often inaccurate reporting about her accident. Contrary to persistent urban legends, she was not decapitated in the crash, though her injuries were catastrophic. After autopsy, her body was prepared for burial at Fairview Cemetery in Penn Argyl, Pennsylvania, her childhood hometown. What makes Mansfield's grave truly unusual is its design, a large, pink-hued, heart-shaped monument that perfectly captures her carefully constructed public image. The stone features her likeness, her birth name, Vera Jane Palmer, and an inscription reading, "We live to love you more each day." Words that seem to speak directly to the dedicated fans who continue visiting decades after her passing. The strangeness doesn't end with the monument's shape. For years after her burial, unexplained phenomena were reported around her grave. Visitors claimed to smell her signature perfume near the monument, even during winter months when no flowers were present. Others reported hearing whispers or seeing brief apparitions of a blonde woman near the site, leading to Mansfield's grave becoming a regular stop on paranormal investigation circuits. Perhaps most unusual is what happened to Mansfield's legacy in Hollywood itself. Despite having no physical memorial in Los Angeles, the site of her fatal accident on US 90 in Louisiana became an unofficial shrine for decades. Fans would leave flowers, photographs, and personal notes at the roadside location. Today, visitors to Mansfield's grave find that her memorial has become an unofficial pilgrimage site for fans of old Hollywood glamour. Many leave lipstick kisses on the stone or small gifts like pink feathers and heart-shaped trinkets. Have you ever visited a celebrity grave that gave you chills? Tell me about it in the comments, because what happened to our next star was even more mysterious. Jean Harlow, the sealed crypt. The original blonde bombshell met a tragic early passing at age 26, but the circumstances of her burial proved almost as dramatic as her meteoric career. Harlow's final resting place reflects both the extraordinary grief of her mother and the strange posthumous journey of one of Hollywood's brightest stars. Harlow's passing was the culmination of a lifetime of suffering that began in childhood. At age 5, she contracted scarlet fever, a nearly fatal illness that permanently damaged her kidneys, the very organs that would eventually take her life. Her controlling mother, Mama Jean Bello, had dominated every aspect of her daughter's life with suffocating intensity. After Harlow's shocking passing from kidney failure in June 1937, her mother made an unprecedented decision. Rather than selecting a traditional burial, she purchased an elaborate private room, not just a plot, in the Great Mausoleum at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. What makes Harlow's entombment particularly unusual is that her mother insisted on an extraordinarily expensive, triple-sealed bronze casket, reportedly costing $5,000 in 1937, approximately $95,000 today. This extravagant vessel was then placed within a solid marble sarcophagus inside the private room, essentially creating 3 layers of separation between Harlow and the outside world. The strangeness doesn't end there. Mama Jean insisted that the room remain perpetually filled with fresh flowers, establishing a trust fund specifically for this purpose. For decades after Harlow's passing, staff at Forest Lawn maintained this unusual arrangement. Perhaps most bizarre was Mama Jean's decision regarding the room's accessibility. She established strict rules that no one, not even family members, could enter the sealed chamber after the initial entombment. This created the extraordinary situation where one of Hollywood's most famous stars rests in a room that virtually no living person has seen since 1937. Today, visitors to Forest Lawn can see only the exterior wall of Harlow's private room within the Great Mausoleum. The actual chamber remains sealed, creating one of Hollywood's most inaccessible memorials. But even that sealed crypt doesn't compare to the mystery surrounding our next legend. John Barrymore, the borrowed grave. The legendary actor known as the Great Profile experienced perhaps the most bizarre posthumous journey of any Hollywood star, one involving drinking buddies, a morgue heist, and a macabre practical joke that would sound too outlandish, even for fiction. Barrymore's alcoholism began in his early teens as an escape from a family legacy that felt more like a curse than a blessing. His father, Maurice Barrymore, had suffered a complete mental breakdown, spending his final years in an asylum. John once confided to a friend that he felt doomed by genetics and drank to silence the voices in his head. Barrymore's passing from cirrhosis and other complications in May 1942 marked the end of a tumultuous life filled with theatrical triumph and personal excess. His body was prepared for a dignified funeral at Pierce Brothers Mortuary in Los Angeles. What happened next has become Hollywood legend, though separating fact from embellishment remains challenging. According to long-standing accounts, Barrymore's friends, reportedly including fellow actors Errol Flynn and W.C. Fields, conspired to borrow his body before burial for one final prank. Director Raoul Walsh allegedly bribed morgue attendants to release Barrymore's body for a few hours, then transported it to Flynn's home. There, they supposedly propped the deceased actor in a chair during a poker game, raised drinks in his honor, and took photographs. While this extraordinary story has been disputed, enough witnesses maintained its truth over decades that the incident has become inseparable from Barrymore's legacy. The strangeness continued after Barrymore's actual funeral. Though initially buried in the family plot in Philadelphia, his son later had his father's remains moved to Mount Vernon Cemetery in 1980, believing this location better suited the actor's status. Perhaps most unusual is that for years after his passing, rumors persisted that Barrymore wasn't in either grave, that his body had actually been cremated after the morgue incident. These rumors were finally put to rest when documentation confirmed his intact burial. Today, visitors to Barrymore's actual grave find a dignified monument that gives no hint of his body's alleged adventures. The inscription reads simply, "Good night, sweet prince," the famous line from Hamlet. Do you think that poker game story really happened? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because our next star's burial choice was absolutely heartbreaking. Steve McQueen, the Ocean View Ranch. The king of cool chose an extraordinarily isolated and breathtaking final resting place that perfectly captures his independent spirit and lifelong desire to escape Hollywood's constraints. McQueen's burial location remains one of the most difficult celebrity graves to access, requiring a genuine pilgrimage for fans seeking to pay respects. McQueen's need for escape was rooted in a childhood of abandonment and abuse that he rarely discussed publicly. His father left when Steve was 6 months old, and his mother would disappear for days at a time, leaving him alone and terrified. By age 9, McQueen was stealing to survive. The trauma created a man who never felt safe anywhere, who needed constant motion and the promise of escape to function. After his passing from mesothelioma complications, in November 1980, McQueen's body was cremated the following day. What happened next defied Hollywood convention. Rather than being interred in a prestigious cemetery alongside other film legends, McQueen's ashes were taken to a remote location that few would ever have associated with the sophisticated screen star. His remains were scattered at sea off the coast of Santa Paula, California, but not from a conventional boat or shoreline location. Instead, McQueen's ashes were carried aloft in a vintage World War II-era Stearman biplane, piloted by his friend Sammy Mason. As the aircraft soared over the Pacific, McQueen's remains were released into the wind, merging with the ocean he had loved. What makes this particularly unusual is that no specific marker or monument was erected at the time. McQueen explicitly wanted to avoid creating a tourist attraction or shrine. However, fans eventually established an unofficial memorial site at the hangar, where McQueen had kept his vintage aircraft collection. In 2012, a group of aviation enthusiasts and McQueen fans raised funds to create a small, tasteful monument near the airfield where his ashes were last on land. Unlike traditional celebrity memorials, this marker doesn't contain any remains. It simply acknowledges the location's significance in McQueen's final journey. Today, true McQueen devotees sometimes charter flights from the Santa Paula airport, following approximately the same route his ashes took on their final journey. Unlike conventional grave visitors who can leave flowers or mementos, these aerial pilgrims can only offer a moment of silent appreciation, perhaps the most fitting tribute to an actor who always valued freedom above all else. But McQueen's free-spirited memorial is nothing compared to the discrimination our next star faced, even in her final resting place. Hattie McDaniel, the segregated Oscar winner's final insult. The first African American to win an Academy Award, faced discrimination even in passing, when the cemetery she chose refused to accept her remains because of her race. McDaniel's burial story represents one of Hollywood's most shameful chapters. McDaniel endured constant criticism from both sides of the racial divide. White studios limited her to stereotypical roles, while many African Americans criticized her for accepting demeaning parts. The NYACP even condemned her Oscar win, arguing that it perpetuated harmful stereotypes. McDaniel famously responded, "I'd rather play a maid than be one." But privately, the criticism devastated her. When McDaniel passed away from breast cancer in 1952, she had requested burial at Hollywood Cemetery, now Hollywood Forever, alongside other film legends. However, the cemetery's whites-only policy prevented her interment there, forcing her family to find alternative arrangements. She was eventually buried at Angeles Rosedale Cemetery, one of the few cemeteries in Los Angeles that accepted African American remains. What makes McDaniel's burial particularly tragic is that it represented a final act of the same discrimination she had faced throughout her career. While her Gone with the Wind co-stars would eventually be buried in prestigious locations, McDaniel was relegated to a modest cemetery, far from the Hollywood glamour she had helped create. The strangeness of her burial extends to the decades-long effort to properly honor her memory. In 1999, nearly 50 years after her passing, Hollywood Cemetery finally offered to create a cenotaph, symbolic grave, for McDaniel on their grounds, acknowledging their shameful treatment of the Oscar winner. Perhaps most unusual is how McDaniel's burial became a catalyst for civil rights action. Her exclusion from Hollywood Cemetery sparked protests and legal challenges that eventually led to the desegregation of cemeteries throughout Los Angeles, making her rejection in her final resting place a victory for future generations. Today, McDaniel's actual grave at Angeles Rosedale features a modest marker, while her cenotaph at Hollywood Forever Cemetery draws thousands of visitors annually. The dual memorials serve as a reminder of both the discrimination she faced and the barriers she broke down for others. This story still makes me angry. Do you think McDaniel finally got the recognition she deserved? Share your thoughts below, because our next star's burial reflects the loneliness that haunted her entire life. Louise Brooks, the lost girl's lonely end. The iconic flapper, whose bob haircut defined an era, passed away alone and forgotten in Rochester, New York, her final resting place, as unconventional as the life that preceded it. Brooks's burial reflects both her fierce independence and the tragic isolation of her later years. Brooks's entire life was shaped by childhood violation that occurred when she was 9 years old. When she finally told her mother years later, she was blamed for leading him on, leaving her with deep trauma about relationships. This early violation explained her lifelong inability to form lasting romantic attachments. Brooks passed away of a heart attack in 1985 at age 78 in her tiny Rochester apartment, where she had lived as a recluse for over 30 years. She was discovered days later by social workers, surrounded by stacks of books and film magazines, her only companions in her final years. What makes Brooks's burial unusual is that she was cremated and her ashes scattered in an unmarked location, with no grave marker or memorial. This was partly due to financial constraints. She passed away nearly penniless despite her former fame, but also reflected her lifelong desire to disappear from public view. The strangeness extends to how Brooks orchestrated her own invisibility. She had specifically requested that no funeral service be held and that her passing not be publicized until after her cremation. Only a handful of people attended her small memorial service, mostly elderly Rochester residents who had befriended her in her final years. Perhaps most tragic is that Brooks's anonymity in her final resting place mirrored her obscurity in her final decades. The woman who had once been photographed with Charlie Chaplin and starred in German masterpieces passed away unknown to her neighbors, who knew her only as an eccentric elderly woman who rarely left her apartment. Today, Brooks's lack of a grave has itself become part of her legend. Film scholars must content themselves with visiting her former apartment building in Rochester, where a small plaque now acknowledges that the legendary actress once lived there. The absence of a traditional burial site seems fitting for a woman who always rejected conventional expectations, even in her final resting place. Our next star also chose to disappear, but for completely different reasons. Mae West. The mausoleum she never visited. The sultry star, who famously invited fans to come up and see me sometime, selected a final resting place she never actually visited during her lifetime, creating one of Hollywood's strangest burial arrangements, and a posthumous situation that seems at odds with her forward-thinking personality. West's choice of a traditional burial location she never visited reflected the profound contradictions that defined her private life. Despite her bold, public persona, she was deeply influenced by her mother's strict Victorian values and spent much of her life trying to reconcile these opposing forces. In her final years, she became increasingly reclusive, surrounded by muscle men half her age, whom she employed ostensibly as bodyguards. West's passing in November 1980, at age 87, followed a career that had broken numerous boundaries regarding female independence. Given her progressive attitudes during life, the extremely traditional nature of her burial arrangements surprised many who knew her. What makes West's burial truly unusual is that she purchased crypts for herself and various family members in Brooklyn's Cypress Hills Abbey Mausoleum in the 1930s, despite having left New York permanently when she moved to Hollywood. This decision meant her remains would need to be transported approximately 2,800 miles from Los Angeles to Brooklyn after her passing. According to those close to West, she never once visited the mausoleum after purchasing the crypts, despite returning to New York occasionally for performances. This created the peculiar situation where one of Hollywood's most controlling personalities selected a final resting place she herself never inspected or approved in person. Perhaps most unusual is the contrast between West's provocative public image and her extremely traditional burial location. Cypress Hills Abbey Mausoleum is a highly conventional, even austere facility, a stark departure from the flamboyant, boundary-pushing persona West cultivated throughout her career. Today, visitors to West's crypt find a modest marker that gives little indication of her significance to entertainment and cultural history. The simple plaque reads only Mae West 1893 to 1980, creating a final resting place that seems remarkably understated for a woman whose career was defined by excess and boundary-breaking independence. But West's strange burial choice is nothing compared to the persecution that followed our next star, even beyond the grave. Paul Robeson. The persecution that followed him to the grave. The Renaissance man who conquered Broadway, Hollywood, and concert halls worldwide was destroyed by government persecution that continued even after his passing. Robeson's burial site reflects both his global impact and the price he paid for his political convictions. Robeson endured systematic persecution that would have broken most people. During the McCarthy era, the FBI conducted illegal surveillance, tapped his phones, and pressured venues to cancel his concerts, destroying his livelihood. For 8 years, from 1950 to 1958, the State Department revoked his passport, trapping him in America while destroying his international career. The stress contributed to severe depression and multiple attempts at self-harm that were covered up by his family. When Robeson passed away in Philadelphia in 1976, at age 77, the FBI was still maintaining a file on him, continuing surveillance even as he lay dying. His funeral arrangements reflected the complex legacy of a man who had been both internationally celebrated and domestically ostracized. Robeson was buried in Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, in a relatively modest grave that gave little indication of his former global fame. What makes his burial unusual is that for years after his passing, visitors to his grave were routinely photographed by unknown individuals, later revealed to be FBI agents who continued monitoring those who came to pay respects. The strangeness extends to the inscription on his gravestone, which reads simply Paul Robeson, 1898 to 1976, with no reference to his achievements as an actor, assistant, singer, athlete, or activist. This was partly due to family fears that a more elaborate monument might attract vandalism from those who still viewed him as a communist sympathizer. Perhaps most tragic is how Robeson's burial location had to be chosen for security rather than preference. His family wanted him buried in Princeton, New Jersey, where he was born, but feared that his grave might be desecrated by political opponents. Today, Robeson's grave has become a gathering place for civil rights activists and performers who understand his significance. In recent years, flowers, concert programs, and political buttons have appeared regularly on his marker, placed by admirers from around the world who remember what America tried to forget. And speaking of stars who face discrimination, our next legend story will absolutely break your heart. May Wong, the trailblazer, who passed away in exile. The first Chinese-American movie star shattered racial barriers on screen, but paid an enormous personal price for her pioneering courage. Wong's burial reflects both her groundbreaking achievements and the tragic isolation that defined her final years. Wong's childhood was marked by the daily humiliation of prejudice that would shadow her entire career. Born in Los Angeles' Chinatown, she was regularly pelted with stones and slurs walking to school, while classmates mocked her appearance and accent. When she achieved stardom, the pain only intensified. She was constantly forced to play stereotypical roles as villains or exotic temptresses, watching white actresses in yellowface win the leading lady parts she deserved. Wong passed away of a heart attack in 1961 at age 56 in her small Santa Monica apartment, found days later by concerned friends who hadn't heard from her. Her passing barely registered in the Hollywood press that had once celebrated her beauty and talent. She was buried in Rosedale Cemetery in Los Angeles, not among the stars in Forest Lawn, but in a modest section usually reserved for middle-class families. What makes Wong's burial particularly poignant is that her grave went unmarked for decades. Unlike other stars who received elaborate monuments immediately after their passing, Wong's family couldn't afford a proper headstone, leaving her in an anonymous plot marked only by a small metal plaque. It wasn't until 1998 that fans and film historians raised funds to install a proper granite marker acknowledging her groundbreaking contributions to cinema. The strangeness of Wong's burial extends to its location. While most Asian American families of her generation were buried in segregated sections of cemeteries, Wong's plot sits integrated among graves of various ethnicities, a small victory for integration that she fought for throughout her life, but achieved only in her final resting place. Perhaps most tragic is how Wong's burial reflects the industry's treatment of her during life. While contemporary stars received massive funerals with thousands of mourners, Wong's service was attended by fewer than 30 people, mostly family members and Chinese American community leaders, who understood her significance, even if Hollywood didn't. Today, Wong's grave has become a pilgrimage site for Asian American actors and film students who leave offerings of flowers, coins, and handwritten notes thanking her for her courage. In 2022, she became the first Asian American to appear on U.S. currency, finally receiving in her final resting place the recognition that eluded her in life. Wong's story always makes me emotional. Which of these burial stories has surprised you most so far? Let me know in the comments, because our next star's final resting place is the stuff of legends. Jimmy Durante, the wife he couldn't join. The beloved comedian with the famously large nose ended his signature performances with the phrase, "Good night, Mrs. Calabash, wherever you are," a mysterious dedication that connected to his unusual burial arrangements and one of Hollywood's most touching love stories. Durante's devotion to his first wife, Jayne, was born from a shared understanding of pain. Jayne suffered from severe mental health issues and alcoholism, conditions that were poorly understood and heavily stigmatized in the 1920s and 1930s. Rather than abandon her, Durante became her devoted caretaker, often canceling performances to tend to her during her darkest episodes. Durante's passing in January 1980, at age 86, came after a remarkable career, spanning vaudeville, radio, film, and television. His burial arrangements reflected both his sentimental nature and the complex romantic history that defined his personal life. What makes Durante's burial truly unusual is that his grave at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City was purchased and planned decades before his passing. Not for himself, but for his first wife, Jayne, who passed away of heart failure in 1943. After her passing, the devastated Durante bought adjacent plots, intending for them to be reunited after his own passing. The strangeness emerges from what happened in the intervening decades. 16 years after Jayne's passing, the 67-year-old Durante married his second wife, Margie Little. Their marriage lasted until his passing, but created a poignant dilemma. Should he be buried beside his first wife, as planned, or with Margie? In a decision that reflected his sentimental loyalty, Durante chose to be buried, as originally planned, beside Jayne. This created the unusual situation where his grave marker bears the name of his first wife, while his second wife eventually was buried elsewhere. Perhaps most unusual is the connection between Durante's burial and his famous catchphrase. For decades, Durante refused to explain his signature line, "Good night, Mrs. Calabash, wherever you are." After his passing, close friends revealed that Mrs. Calabash was his private nickname for Jayne, derived from the California town of Calabasas, where they had once shared a special day together. Today, visitors to Durante's grave find a modest marker that gives little indication of his significance to entertainment history. The simple stone, bearing both his and Jayne's names, stands as a testament to a love that transcended both his fame and the passage of time. Our next star also chose love over convention, but with devastating consequences. Marlene Dietrich, the divided grave. The sultry German-American icon's final resting place reflects the complex dualities that defined her life. Caught between two countries, two identities, and ultimately two burial sites that tell a fascinating story of belonging and rejection. Dietrich's anti-Nazi stance came at enormous personal cost that few truly understood. When Hitler personally requested her support in 1935, offering her unprecedented wealth and status, her refusal meant giving up everything: her homeland, her family's safety, and her mother's love. Her own mother never forgave her for choosing America over Germany, and they never spoke again. Dietrich's passing in Paris in 1992 created an immediate controversy about where her remains should rest. Though she had become an American citizen in 1939 and had served the Allied cause during World War II, Dietrich's relationship with her birthplace remained complicated throughout her life. After careful consideration, Dietrich's daughter decided to honor what she claimed were her mother's wishes by arranging burial in Berlin, the city of her birth, despite Dietrich having vowed never to return to Germany. On May 16, 1992, her body was flown to Berlin for a funeral attended by German dignitaries and international celebrities. What makes Dietrich's burial truly unusual is its precise location. Rather than being interred in a prestigious central cemetery, as might befit a star of her magnitude, Dietrich's grave lies in the small, relatively obscure Städtischer Friedhof, Drei, in Berlin-Schöneberg. The modest location was chosen partly because 3 generations of her family were buried there, but also because authorities feared a more prominent location might attract neo-Nazi vandalism. The strangeness doesn't end there. While Dietrich's physical remains rest in Berlin, significant portions of her estate were explicitly bequeathed to the Film Museum in Berlin, but with a striking provision. These items could only be displayed after German reunification. Perhaps strangest of all is what happened in Paris, where Dietrich had lived her final reclusive years. Though her body was transported to Berlin, many Parisians considered her one of their own. This led to the creation of an unofficial memorial site at her former apartment building, where admirers still leave flowers and notes, essentially creating a second spiritual grave that exists in parallel with her official Berlin resting place. Today, visitors to Dietrich's actual grave find a simple marker bearing only her name, birth, and passing dates, and a German inscription that translates to, "Here I stand on the marker of my days." But Dietrich's divided legacy is nothing compared to the complete mystery surrounding our next star. Thomas Ince, the pioneer's mysterious end. Thomas Ince isn't a name most people know today, but without him, Hollywood as we know it wouldn't exist. He invented the studio system, the shooting script, the production schedule. Every movie you've ever watched owes something to Thomas Ince, but his final resting place is shrouded in one of Hollywood's greatest unsolved mysteries. By 1924, Ince was 44 years old and worth millions. He owned his own studio, had production deals with major distributors, lived in a mansion in Benedict Canyon. He was also in negotiations for a major merger that would have made him one of the most powerful men in Hollywood. November 16th, 1924. Ince boards William Randolph Hearst's yacht, the Oneida, for a weekend cruise celebrating Ince's 44th birthday. Also on board, Hearst's mistress Marion Davies, Charlie Chaplin, and various other Hollywood elite. What happened next depends on who you believe. The official story: Ince ate something that disagreed with him, developed severe indigestion, was taken ashore at San Diego, went home, and passed away 2 days later of heart failure. The whispered story that's persisted for a century. Hearst caught Marion Davies with Chaplin in a compromising position. In a jealous rage, he pulled a weapon and fired. In the dark, he hit Ince by mistake. Here are the facts that don't add up. Ince's body was cremated immediately. No autopsy was performed, despite his sudden passing at 44. Every single person on that yacht developed selective amnesia about the weekend. Hearst banned any mention of the cruise in his newspapers. Luella Parsons, a struggling gossip columnist, was allegedly on the yacht. Right after Ince's passing, Hearst gave her a lifetime contract with his newspapers, making her the most powerful gossip columnist in Hollywood. Hush money? Nobody knows. Here's what we know for certain. Thomas Ince, healthy 44-year-old millionaire, got on Hearst's yacht on November 16th. By November 19th, he was gone. Everything else is mystery. The man who built Hollywood's foundation passed away under circumstances so suspicious that we're still talking about them a century later. His innovations couldn't buy him a legacy untainted by suspicion. Drop a comment. Do you think Ince was the victim of foul play? Because what happened to our next star is no mystery at all, just pure heartbreak. Pola Negri, the vamp who loved too much. Pola Negri was Hollywood's first European import. Paramount brought her over from Germany in 1922, specifically to compete with Metro's Greta Garbo. She was exotic, mysterious, sophisticated, everything American audiences associated with European glamour. But her final resting place tells the story of a woman whose greatest love became her greatest mistake. Negri was also a survivor. Born in Poland, lived through World War I, made it to Berlin, became a star there, then conquered Hollywood. She was tough, smart, and taking home $10,000 weekly by 1925. That's $150,000 weekly today. Then Rudolph Valentino passed away, and Pola made the mistake that destroyed her career. She and Valentino had been lovers. Or maybe they hadn't. Nobody really knows for sure. But when Valentino suddenly passed away in August 1926, Pola turned his funeral into her own personal performance. She fainted at the funeral, had to be carried out, collapsed at the graveside, made sure every photographer got the shot. She commissioned a massive floral arrangement spelling out Pola to sit by his coffin. She wore widow's weeds for months. America hated it. They thought she was using Valentino's passing for publicity. The backlash was swift and vicious. Paramount dropped her in 1928. She went back to Europe, made films in Germany and France. When World War II started, she managed to get back to America in 1941. But now she had a new problem. She'd made films for UFA, the German studio, in the 1930s. As far as Hollywood was concerned, she'd worked for the Nazis. She was completely blacklisted. The exotic vamp, who'd once commanded $10,000 weekly, couldn't get work as an extra. She moved to San Antonio, Texas, of all places. Why Texas? Because it was cheap, and she was broke. For the next 40 years, Pola Negri lived in San Antonio, forgotten by Hollywood. She sold her jewelry piece by piece to survive. The woman who'd once worn million-dollar necklaces was pawning rings to pay rent. August 1st, 1987. Pola Negri passed away in San Antonio at age 90. The local newspaper ran a small obituary. Most people in town had no idea they'd been living near a woman who'd once been one of the biggest stars in the world. Her funeral was attended by about a dozen people. No Hollywood representation. The exotic vamp who'd driven men wild passed away quietly in Texas. Her fortune long gone, her fame not even a memory. But even Pola's forgotten grave doesn't compare to our final star's absolutely shocking burial arrangement. Marie Prevost, The Tragic End. Hollywood tried to hide. Marie Prevost was proof that you could reinvent yourself in Hollywood. Born Mary Bickford Dunn in Ontario, Canada, she became Marie Prevost, sophisticated comedy star. And for a while, it worked beautifully. But her final resting place became the center of one of Hollywood's most disturbing cover-ups. In the 1920s, Marie was Warner Brothers' biggest female comedy star. She was earning $1,500 weekly by 1926, had a beautiful home in Beverly Hills, and her pick of roles. she'd successfully transitioned from Mac Sennett, bathing beauty, to legitimate actress. Then 1927 happened. Two disasters that started her downward spiral. First, her mother was lost in a car accident. The grief was devastating. Second, talkies arrived, and Marie's weight fluctuations from crash dieting made her unemployable at major studios. By 1936, she was living in a tiny apartment, behind on rent, behind on everything. She had one friend left, her dachshund, Maxie. This little dog was everything to her. January 1937. Marie was trying to diet again, hoping to get work. She was drinking heavily to suppress her appetite and barely eating. January 19th, the neighbors complained about barking. Maxie had been barking for 2 days straight. The landlord thought Marie had abandoned the dog and used his key to check. Marie was on her bed, fully dressed. She'd been gone for at least 2 days. The coroner said acute alcoholism and malnutrition. She'd literally starved herself while destroying her body with alcohol. She was 38 years old. But here's the part that makes this truly tragic, and that Hollywood tried to cover up. Maxie, trying to wake his owner, had been gently nudging at her legs and arms. Not aggressively, desperately. This little dog trying anything to wake up the only person who'd ever loved him. When Kenneth Anger wrote about it in Hollywood Babylon, he turned it into something grotesque. That's not what happened. The coroner's report was clear. These were desperate attempts to wake her. Joan Crawford paid for the funeral, kept it small, quiet. They didn't want publicity about how one of Hollywood's brightest comedy stars had passed away. Alone, forgotten, so broke she couldn't afford food, with only her dog trying to save her. That image haunts me. One of Hollywood's brightest comedy stars passed away alone, with only her loyal dog as witness to her final moments. 17 stars, 17 extraordinary final journeys. And what strikes me most about these stories is how they humanize figures who often seemed larger than life on screen. From Chaplin's body-snatching incident to Harlow's sealed crypt that no one can enter, these burial sites reveal new dimensions to personalities we thought we knew from their performances. These aren't just graves. They're the final plot twists in lives already overflowing with drama. Some chose privacy, others couldn't escape publicity, even in their final resting places. These burial sites, whether elaborate or modest, accessible or hidden away, remind us that behind the characters we loved were real people with complex lives and relationships. These 17 legends gave us dreams, laughter, romance, and escape during some of history's darkest moments. In return, they deserved dignity in their final rest. Some found it, others didn't. But all of them left legacies that transcend their unusual burial arrangements. Remember their names, remember their stories, because even in their strangest final resting places, these stars continue to shine. If these burial mysteries fascinated you as much as they fascinated me, you're going to love what I'm uncovering next. The 10 stars who faked their own disappearances and the elaborate schemes they used to escape fame forever. But before I can reveal those shocking stories, I need to know you're as passionate about Hollywood's hidden secrets as I am. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because these stories deserve to be told, and some powerful people would prefer they stay buried forever.